Hello again. It's a lovely sunny afternoon. For some reason, I was thinking about 1997 and lecturing and getting my first lecturing post at UEA, the University of East Anglia, all the way back in 97, which is now 27 years ago. Is that right? Um, I got the job at the beginning of the year when my, I think, second novel had come out in paperback. And um, I know they had their favourites, or they didn't expect me to turn up and get this job. I was 27 and from the north. I wasn't really known to the UEA people, and to me, it'd always been this really fancy place. Even applying for my MA in creative writing, when there was just two places to apply for these things, Lancaster or UEA, I opted to stay at Lancaster because UEA seemed too forbidding. It seemed too Ian McEwan and Ishiguro and Martin Amis and Southern and 1980s and uh, straight and fancy and literary and all those things, which it kind of was in some ways. But I applied for this teaching job because it was the most brilliant job in the world. I'd published a couple of books and I'd got my PhD on Angela Carter in '96, and I was absolutely qualified to go and teach the MA in creative writing, the novel writing course, and teach the undergraduate courses and organise a course on theory and contemporary literature. It was so perfect for what I'd done, so I went for it, which is always the answer now for me. Always go for it, and I got the job. Very, very nerve wracking to go all the way down there from Edinburgh down to Norwich on a million trains. And they were kind of nice to me. Some were a bit patronising and a bit awful. If you turn up at places with a northern accent, people can treat you like absolute shite on a stick. If in the worlds of kind of academia and writing and publishing, bizarre, even in this day and age. I remember somebody on the panel who will remain nameless. His question to me in this really kind of serious interview was, "Are you meant to have that label hanging off your suit jacket?" Because I'd left on the little label there that's I'd bought a new suit for this interview. I'd never had a suit before, and I think it cost £110. I was very proud, but it had the label attached with two little threads there, and of course you're meant to pull it off. But I styled it out. I realised this was still on, and this professor very snootily said, "Are you meant to have that still there?" And I said, "Yes, yes, of course. It's the style. It's a label." Anyway, late that night, very late, I was back in Edinburgh and got the phone call from the then Dean of English and American Studies, Roger Sales, who was always very, very friendly and very nice to me, saying that I'd got the job. And I went down a few weeks later to do um, a guest lecture on their first year course on Angela Carter as a kind of hello to the department, as a welcome. And they gave me 12 hours of meetings with people from the faculty. I had 12 meetings and they took up 12 hours. And I was all over campus and I was in town and it was very entertaining. Lorna Sage phoned up from Florence, where she was away for that term, and she was like, "Thank God they had the sense to appoint you even when I wasn't there." She was always a massive supporter of mine. I'd met her a few years before at a Cheltenham festival do in the cafe, having gin at midnight after some talk on Virago, I think, or maybe Angela Carter that she'd done with Edmund White. And she was chatting away with me and her fellow Rupert, who was always there. "Rupert, bring the special water." There's always a bag with bottles with them of special water. And they were genial and funny. And she said, "By God, you can talk." Must have just been gabbling away. I was 23 and uh, full of all this stuff, reading all this stuff and theory and ideas. Anyway, she was very pleased that I was appointed to UEA, and Lorna was one of my great allies, as she had been to Angela Carter and various other people over the years. And there was her ex-husband, Vic Sage, who was there, a Gothic expert and mischief maker and a great ally as well. Um, and they'd been people who'd come from working class backgrounds into academia in the 60s and had known of UEA as a great um, leveler, as a place that lived up to the ideals of a comprehensive education and new universities where people would mix across every barrier of class and race and kind and um, intellectual school, and that's what that kind of university was. It was changing in the 90s, of course, because universities were changing and becoming worse. They were becoming money oriented and slightly wicked and um, changing their makeup because, of course, grants had gone out and posher, stupider people were around the place, basically. People who could afford to be there. And so you'd lost that egalitarianism that 60s universities always had. And there was a kind of different element creeping in behind the scenes and amongst the faculty, a more harder edged um, Thatcherite kind of thinking, I think. Anyway, the people I met there on the whole were great. There were some stinkers, of course, and I could talk at length about some of the awful people, but I shan't. I do remember um, some very odd things being said at these meetings that I had in the cafe in town where the cinema was, and met two members of faculty there. And then I went back to campus and met others, and they were all saying things about each other. They were drawing up. Um, they're giving me a sense of how where the lines were drawn between people, who the different factions were, and people said things that were quite surprising about each other to this new person turning up. And I remember going to the dean's um, new flat on campus where he'd moved in with his fancy woman, as his secretary called her, very disapprovingly. Um, the dramas were just like being in The History Man, written by Malcolm Bradbury, who'd worked there for years and years. And I was presented in Roger's flat with my own bottle of wine as I stepped through the door and proceeded to get quite drunk. It was a very boozy place in lots of ways in the 90s. And so that was early. That was, the first day I went there. I had a whole summer to get through first, and Jeremy was very ill, and he was in hospital with Crohn's disease, which is a big drama in that summer. And I had to move down by myself um, and rent a colleague's house. And I moved down the very weekend that Princess Diana was killed, and I didn't know anything about it because I had no TV and no radio. And so the whole place went quiet in this peculiar way, and I thought the bomb had gone off. I do remember sitting in a Chinese restaurant the night before, and a takeaway, and reading the paper, and seeing all this terrible stuff about how awful Diana was the day before, and then the next day, of course, she was, Saint Diana. Um, so that was a weird introduction to the place, to a new city, in a place that was in mourning in that peculiar way that everything went into mourning in '97. It was a year of extremes, really, because earlier we'd had New Labour coming in this sense of optimism, which I think people forget about or minimise now. The sense in 1997 that things could change for the better and we could be living in a better country rather than a much worse one, which is how it ended up. Anyway, I came back to Norwich in that the end of that summer and began this year of first year of teaching, and met all these colleagues. Andrew Motion, who I taught the MA in novel writing with, who was about to become poet laureate and protested that he didn't really want to be. Of course, he knew he wanted to be, and that was one of the reasons he was there. Really, that he was there because they thought he would get the place a lot of kudos, a lot of publicity, which I guess he did. I asked, could I sit in on one of his MA in poetry classes, and he said, absolutely not. He was very friendly apart from that. Um, I do remember him saying that I must forgive them for working in this place, this terrible campus where everything was made out of concrete. And I said, everywhere I've ever been is made out of concrete. My first memories are of Peter Lee and and then Newton Aycliffe and then Lancaster University. The world is poured concrete to the children of the 1970s. Anyway, he was properly old school in a sense. He was a very Oxford, Cambridge, and so were lots of the people on the MA, I think. And they'd been in London doing media jobs, and they'd come back to university. So I was younger than some of my students on the MA, and some of them were very nice, and and some really weren't. Some thought I was too young or too northern, too callow, or they had no respect. Or it was Andrew who was the star, and I was just no one. So that was quite difficult to negotiate in my first months of teaching there. When a class of grown-ups just treat you with slight contempt, and some of them did. I remember suggesting that we do some warm-up exercises with writing, because I think that it's not just about sitting around talking about your latest chapter and commenting on edits that you could make. A lot of creative writing teaching at that time became a discussion of line edit stuff, because you'd focus on about 5,000 words only. And because it was Andrew teaching the other half, they got used to running it almost like a poetry workshop where you're very focused on just the page. So they never got off into conversations of plotting or genre. No interest in doing that. And when I did try to deviate from the kind of fiddle faddle of can we move this comma, can we change this word, they weren't very happy. And I suggested doing all kinds of workshop stuff, writing on the spot stuff, writing to prompts, exposing yourself a bit. I had some rebellions. I had one couple, this fella and his girlfriend, who were both on the course. I think they'd met on the course, got up and left because I said I thought we should get away from the page and brainstorm more and challenge ourselves and do exercises. And he said he wasn't at UEA to do parlor games, to play parlor games with the likes of me. And off he went. So that was fun. There was a few things like that. Um, yeah, I had a few rebellions from them. The undergraduates were more rewarding in some ways because they had they'd arrived from a background of creative writing that was all about creative play and more like kind of art school stuff, and they were used to that. They were used to inventing things. They didn't want to just sit down and write a novel, a literary novel from beginning to end in a couple of terms and then go off. It's not that's what the MA kind of promised you would do, and I don't think that's how necessarily. Oops, my battery's going. Necessarily how novels work, but there were lots of challenges and lots of fights. There's fights were there, tussles, I would say. At the same time, there was all sorts of other courses I was involved in, text and textuality, which was a kind of experimental attempt to combine stuff from creative writing with theory. And I would lecture in tandem with John Cook, who was a very nimble and clever poetry specialist and somebody very involved in theory. And we talked about combining all kinds of theoretical people with creative people, and looking at lots of essays by people like Susan Sontag. And we had the whole of the second year writing all kinds of experimental stuff. And that caused shockwaves from people who didn't expect to be challenged and write things out of their comfort zone. I had somebody come to me once, I think a third year, and said that they'd been so challenged with courses that they'd never had this kind of thing before. They'd breezed through their education by learning things off by rote. And so I thought this was, well, good. And she said, but what are you going to do about it? How are you going to make me do better? You should have been doing the stuff. You can't do this by rote. And that was interesting. Somebody just appalled at the idea that they'd have to think. Of course, lots of them did think for themselves and were very good at doing that. it was that kind of place that attracted those people. You just had to look at the kind of reading lists and the courses that were on offer to see that it was unconventional. And that was good. That suited me. I guess it became more conventional as time went on. Perhaps I felt that. Um, Later, I taught at MMU in Manchester, and that was uh, similar. I think that's to do with changing times with creative writing in universities anyway. And that by the time I left MMU, I'd taught creative writing for a long time, and they were at the point of saying, well, critics can teach creative writing as well, surely, because they write too. And do we really need writers on campus? And that's the point at which I thought, oh, this is changing for the worse. They're going to replace us with not AI, but replace us with people who weren't writers anyway. Because of course, writers on campus are troublemakers. They they can't be relied upon to be good committee members or keep proper minutes or not go off into daydreams or not to lead students into kind of all kinds of rebellions. And that's the stuff I enjoyed. I thought that was important. That's what universities were all about, having difficult conversations and having loud debates. I remember starting up courses on things like fantasy and the 1960s novel, and that was all good fun. That was kind of later on at UEA. And there were plans to do courses on teaching children's writing at kind of MA level. And eventually I got that happening at MMU. And I think that's still going. I hope it is. I do notice now that some places are teaching more genre fiction, which is good. I think they've got a crime course at UEA. I think I saw something about that, which is good. Crime is the kind of respectable end of genre fiction. I always thought these places like Arvon or UEA, all these fancy places, shouldn't just focus on literary fiction, whatever that is. What it often means is university fiction, what the Americans called university fiction, written by middle class people with degrees. That isn't the only kind of fiction. And obviously, because people like Angus Wilson and Malcolm Bradbury started up these courses, they went in that direction. But it isn't always inevitable. It would be fantastic if there were courses on science fiction, on horror, on thriller writing, domestic thrillers, um, police procedurals. How fantastic to have people coming in and giving lectures on that stuff. Anyway, I still, it turns out, have strong feelings about this stuff. I didn't think I did. I really do. I think creative writing teaching was exciting. I thought you'd bring people into the room and stuff would be created that wouldn't have happened outside of those, without those people coming together for that particular session. It wasn't just rehashing people's stuff, rubber stamping stuff and pushing them in the direction of agents and editors, which is what the worst creative writing teaching is. And there was a lot of that kind of thing about who is the most respectable looking, who can be relied upon to become a kind of professional writer. There was quite a lot of that. I think it was a good thing for people to just do as part of your degree. It's a great way of thinking creatively and thinking aloud. Writers are problem solvers and creative inventors of stuff, of ideas. And in some, often the writing courses that people had as 1/9 of their overall degree, if they just did one course, became the only clear space they had to synthesize the ideas they were getting from everywhere else. And as we know, the best way of doing well in a degree, in any kind of degree, is to be able to put together all the courses you've got in your head and make a story out of the whole lot. That's always the answer. And writing was often the thing that fused it. Somebody told me the word recently for what the Japanese do when they fix. It's when Jeremy smashed my favorite cup, and filled it with araldite or some kind of strong glue. The Japanese custom of using gold to put things back together again. That to me is creative writing teaching, is learning to write creatively. It's the gold that fuses the broken bits of everything else you learn together. Being articulate with language is golden, and it does pull everything together, and still reveals the fractures of everything that you've smashed up in order to deconstruct it and learn what it all means. So I must look up what that word is for the gold in stuff. Anyway, that's just scratching the surface of things I have to say about being a lecturer. It was a job I felt I trained for all my life and that I was meant for. And it was kind of heartbreaking when I got to 41 and had to leave. I just felt I had to leave. It was 7 years at UEA, 7 years at MMU. I'd done 7 years at Lancaster way before that as an undergraduate, postgraduate, and postgraduate teacher. 21 years all in all, working my guts out for this stuff and feeling by the end of it that the university just didn't care, that all these places had changed beyond recognition, and they were kind of factories really. And turning my back on that, on the slightly unfriendly place that MMU had become, was sad, and I've not looked at universities again since. And it is a shame, because I did enjoy seminars and tutorials and even meetings and being part of that world, especially when there were lots and lots of writers of all kinds around. Anyway, bit of nostalgia there. On a sunny afternoon, I will stop there, and next time I'll talk about books again, I promise. See you again soon. Do subscribe and go and look at Patreon and things, and I'll see you again in another episode.